Good morning. Today's date is 4/11/2019. Time now is 9:02 a.m. This is a deposition or interview for Dr. Robert Moffitt. And may the court reporter swear in? Oh, that's right. Because I keep thinking deposition. And we're on.
Okay, so I'm John Weeks. I'm the PAA historian and chair of the PAA History Committee, and with us today are committee members. I'll introduce them in terms of longevity on the committee. Dennis Hodgson, Karen Hardy, Emily Merchant, and Wynn Brown. And of course our purpose here today is to continue the PAA Oral History Project, which got started actually way back with our first PA historian, Anders Lund, and then carried on with Jean van der Tak, our second historian. And I've been the historian for, believe it or not, 25 years now, and we're trying to get caught up over time. But it is our pleasure to be able every year to interview one or two of the past PAA presidents. And today we are very honored to have you, Dr. Robert Moffitt, be with us. And as we indicated to you before we started the tape rolling, Wynn Brown's going to be kind of leading the question, following our interview guide, which you've seen. But any committee member, if they feel that there's a question that needs to be kind of followed up on or asked, then everybody reserves the right to jump in.
Okay, if I may quickly add something, I'd like to express my gratitude for you all for this job you're doing. When I was PAA president, there were some discussions of this, and it's always an issue of coming up with money to assist you, and I was a big supporter of this project, and I haven't been on the board for a while. I'm very happy to see the board is helping support this. I assume they are, and it's just a great endeavor. I wish more associations did this, and PAA is a distinguished organization with a distinguished history, so I think it's just an outstanding effort, so thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Wynn, over to you.
Good, great. Well, thank you so much again for being here, Robert. And we all have the materials. We have your CV, and a lot of us have some of your articles. I thought to get us started, I'm looking at the very top of your CV, and I see that you went to Rice for your undergraduate years, and then of course you got your master's and your PhD from Brown later on. And I wonder if you could walk us through your sort of scholastic history, starting with Rice, and talk about the events or the classes or the teachers who kind of helped you get on this journey to where you are now.
Sure, be happy to. Well, I'm born and raised in Houston, Texas, so I went locally, and I came from a rather low-income family, and the attraction of Rice University at that time was that it was very low tuition, and that's the reason I went there. Rice happens to have a very excellent reputation in math and the sciences, and that was also what I was interested in. And when I was in high school, I was a math guy, and I won several awards in Houston for math, and so it was a fortuitous choice that they had the low tuition. I could tell you some other stories about Rice. They actually had zero tuition for many. The founder, William Marsh Rice, declared in his will that no tuition could ever be charged for Rice University, and the university took it to court, and they were able to start charging tuition, and but it stayed low. I think now it's up to the usual high, extraordinary levels. In any case, so I went to Rice, and I was a mathematics major, which you may not know is a very common starting point for many economists, because economics has a very strong mathematical content. But like most people, I found math, at least at very high levels, to be rather difficult. And I took an economics course. And you understand, this is the 1960s, and I'm very much a child of the 1960s. The social movements, the political movements, I was part of that. And I believed in that, and and doing something socially useful was what it was all about to me. I took one economics course, just introductory economics, and I was just awed by the capability of using my mathematical ability and all my technical skills towards something that was relevant to the real world. Many other students made exactly that, in the 60s, made exactly that same transition. So I immediately switched to economics and now to mathematics. And I took just the usual set of courses. I did take some sociology courses at the time. I actually can't say if the sociology department at Rice has a lot of demographers. I haven't checked lately. I did not have any contact with them, if there were any when I was an undergraduate. But there were some kind of left-wing sociologists in the department, and I, being that orientation, took all those courses and really liked sociology. So I graduated from Rice, and I decided I wanted to be an academic, and went to graduate school in economics, and I went to Brown University. And to be perfectly honest, it was not the best choice for me. Like a lot of undergraduates, I wasn't really given much guidance about different departments and how they differ, and we all now know that they differ a lot. And the economics department at Brown was very theoretical and mathematical. And here I was, a guy interested in social policy and empirical work in the real world. And I went there, and there was almost no faculty there who specialized in that. And so it was a rather frustrating time. I'm very happy I learned a lot more technical skills and hardcore economics at the time. So I'm grateful for what I got. I didn't understand when I was a graduate student, there was this other building across campus called Maxey Hall, which is where the sociology department was, and how distinguished the demographers were over there. We'll maybe get to it. I later came back to Brown, and I did make that discovery then, but as a graduate student, I didn't. But my interest as a graduate student just went directly toward the issues of poverty and disadvantage and the welfare system in the United States. As you can tell from my CV and my work, that has been really my lifelong theme, whether it's economics or demography. This central interest in poverty and the disadvantage has really been, I keep coming back to that, and that's been my sole theme. So that takes me a little bit up to the graduate program in economics. Would you like me to continue?
Well, let me jump in. I'd like to take you back to
even earlier. Okay.
Something you mentioned earlier, and you mentioned that you were from a low-income background. So I heard that, and then I heard that you were a sort of a child of the 1960s and all that was going on in our culture and our country then. What was more important to kind of set you on that pathway where you were passionate about lower income, you're passionate about advantage and lack thereof in our country? Was it your household / parents coupled with the 1960s? Or
which is more important? I would say probably the culture of the 1960s. My family was not extremely lower income. They were lower middle class, working class family. They put high value on education. My mother didn't even have a high school degree. She dropped out in the Depression to help the family. My father did get a high school degree, but he never went to college. He took some part-time night courses. He ended up being an accountant. But they put high value on education, and they were very pushing me in that direction. I don't look back on it as a lost opportunity, but in fact I applied to a number of universities around the country at high school, and I got into some very good ones, but they didn't give me aid, and so I couldn't go, and that's why I went, as I said before, that's why I went to Rice. So that's a perspective that undoubtedly contributes to my development, intellectual development. But I would say that as a high school student growing up in Texas, everybody in my community were hardcore Republicans, and so that's what I grew up in. And they couldn't stand John F. Kennedy. Oh, he was anathema. then I went to college, and like so many people, then I met some other people. My views broadened out, and I got interested in these issues. So I think it was a little bit more. But Rice University, even though it's in Houston, it had the usual undergraduates. They were very liberal, and not entirely so. And I was following everything. The '60s were a period of turmoil, and everything that was going on. I enlisted in Gene McCarthy's campaign in 1968 for president, and went to rallies, and we had a protest at the university against they wouldn't let Abby Hoffman come and speak on campus. The president said no, and so we held a rally across. There were protests anyway, and then I graduated in May of 1960. 1970 was the Cambodia incidents, and that was graduation. We wore black armbands. We stood up. We turned around. We would not face the speaker. It was a unique time that you're gonna have to be there. But I mean that colors my views on many things, and that influence has stayed with me.
Can I have one quick question? Mm-hmm. You talked about President Kennedy, but you didn't mention LBJ, and you didn't mention a war on poverty. Uh-huh. Now, how aware were you, in the context of high school, college, of these kinds of social policy changes that became central to your career?
I wasn't aware at all in high school. I wouldn't say I was particularly Republican myself, and I heard these views of the adults around me, but I think as a high school student I just wasn't aware. I just remember my freshman year, I started reading like Time magazine. Back in those days, you watched the evening news every night. That's where you got your information, CBS or NBC at 6 o'clock, and you read Time magazine or Newsweek, and that was it. And I never heard of the New York Times or anything back then, and the Houston newspapers weren't very good. And I remember, just in my freshman year, picking up an article of Newsweek talking about race relations, and my eyes just opened up and said, "Oh, I get it now. I get what's going on." And it was just a complete revelation. And after that, I just followed through. But as a high school student, I would just say I didn't have any real consciousness of that.
Mm-hmm. So, Robert, we're going to stick in that sort of younger period. I wonder where did the math come from? You mentioned that your father was an accountant or became an accountant. Mm-hmm. There's math in that one way or the other. But were you in a mathematical household? Was there some influence there that sort of turned into something that allowed you to really thrive mathematically, or was that completely a kind of a solo act, as it were?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that myself. I know that my father did have quite an influence, and he was an accountant, and he would just do arithmetic every evening. That was his hobby. And he's an accountant, okay? Ledgers and counting, and we would walk around the house and he just threw all these pieces of paper all over the place with little scribblings and additions, subtractions, and math. He would just sit there at the TV and have a pad and kind of do it. So I'm sure that was just very much influence. I have a son, and I didn't tell him to go into math or anything. But he's all math, and I didn't do anything. But I know that when he was taking courses in math in grade school, he would come home with his homework, and I could help him with it. I mean, I could sit down and say, "Okay, here, do it this way, do it this way." I wasn't pushing it, but I just think that influence was there. My father, actually, I have a brother too, and he also was very mathematical. We both were. My father, have never gone to college, he wanted us supposed to be engineers. He was an accountant for an oil company, and in that company, the high status people were the petroleum engineers, okay? Mm-hmm. And in terms of technical ability. And he did admire technical ability, and he said, "I want you to be a petroleum engineer." And that's what you should do. And he understood that math was important in that. Of course, then we went to college, and we weren't all interested in petroleum engineering or any kind of engineering. We wanted to do, academic scholarship. But I think that probably my father is the major influence there.
And then you went to college, and the economics course changed everything. Do you remember what the context was when you kind of you were on this math track, and then you weren't? What was it about that particular course? And it was probably microeconomics, because that's what we normally start with. What was it? Was it just brilliantly taught, or did something come alive in terms of the principles? And
it was just the principles. I'm an economist. I'm biased. I believe economics provides powerful tools and frameworks and training to understand many issues about society, and it was the social aspect of it that appealed to me in that course. That you understood how what affected how much income people had, what the determinants of poverty and disadvantage, income distribution, inequality, and you had tools for understanding how the distribution of income was changing over time and how it differed between men, women, single mothers, and it provided you with a framework, and there were ways to use my math to kind of do those kind of analytic, and I wasn't. The course was not particularly empirical and statistical. It all kind of came later a little bit, but there was data there, and that was my first exposure to data, because there were numbers in our principles textbook. We used at that time and for 20 years the most famous economics introductory textbook, written by Paul Samuelson. The famous Samuelson textbook. And he was an outstanding writer and expositor, a very unique guy, a genius, Nobel laureate, but could also just talk to a non-economist and explain economics concepts in ways you could understand. So it was the social appeal to it that just really bowled me over, and I said, I'm going to be an economist and work on these issues. It was, really just a transformative experience.
And then you went that way. You went to Brown. You got your master's in economics. You weren't so keen on that, but you picked up a lot of skills, technical skills. You wanted a little bit. You saw the building on the other side of the campus where all the demographers were. Tell us now about your PhD program, because that seems to be something that really put you on the final pathway to what you did your whole career.
Well, as I said, I was interested in poverty and disadvantage and the economics of those issues, and I took my courses. The courses did not have a lot of content of that. In economics, as most social science graduate programs, you do coursework in your first 2 years, and then in your third year go on to your dissertation. And when I went on to my dissertation, I got very interested in a hypothesis, which was, at the time was called the mismatch hypothesis. The mismatch hypothesis was that one of the problems with inner city African American workers was that all the jobs had suburbanized and had moved out of the central cities, as they were in the 30s and 40s, and starting in the 50s with the great suburbanization of the US cities. A lot of the manufacturing jobs had moved out to the suburbs and to outlying areas where there was more land and where they could spread out and have larger and cheaper to build facilities. And because of the weak transportation links networks in most cities, inner city African American men could simply not got out to these jobs. And I was very interested in that, and it was a very empirical dissertation, data on commuting patterns of African Americans, where the jobs were located in different cities around the United States, and I greatly enjoyed it, and I think it was a pretty good job I did. Found there was some truth to it, but every inner city African American have a lot of other problems other than that one. So it was by no means the major explanation for their low incomes and high unemployment rates. But it was a very useful exercise to me. My only problem, and we'll probably come back to it as we go, a little bit further in my career was that I didn't have good supervision because the faculty there were so theoretical, and I didn't have good supervision in how to do empirical work, in statistical methods, or much less in the issues themselves. And so what I'll say, if we get to it later, is that I acquired many more skills after I left graduate school, and really flowered later on. But I appreciate what happened, and that got me started. My thesis advisor was an urban economist. In those days, this is just a footnote about economics, that if you wanted to study poverty, you had to study urban economics. That's where it was located. That was your specialty, because it was thought of as a problem of cities. Today, that's not in economics, that's not the case. And urban economics today is really back to the spatial distributions of population and jobs, and not poverty has moved over to other fields. But so I had a thesis advisor who didn't really, I don't think he'd ever run a regression in his life, but he was very much into urban policy, and so he helped me on the policy side, but wasn't able to really give me much supervision on the empirical side, and how to deal with data, and how to do that kind of research.
From your CV, it looks like you went from Brown to Mathematica at Princeton, and you got involved in a negative income tax project.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely, and that was really when things started to happen for my career. So I went on the job market, and to be honest, the economics faculty at Brown didn't particularly like me, and because I wasn't doing their thing. I wasn't doing the math. I was doing this other stuff. In fact, a little footnote there is that they disliked me. So, and the problem was, I was doing the best on all the exams, but they didn't like what I was doing, and so I got a telephone call from the chairman of the department. He said, "I want you to come in Saturday morning to the department. I want to talk to you." And so, so I went in on a Saturday morning, building completely empty. There's the chairman waiting for me. He said, "I want you to change to the sociology department, and because you're not doing economics." Brown was not the only department like that in the 1960s. In the early 70s, the transformation of economics into what it is today, which is just a broadly policy-oriented empirical field which interacts with, that just wasn't present in most departments back then. Anyway, that's a footnote. So I went out of the job market. I couldn't get a job, basically. I didn't get any good recommendations, and my dissertation was good, but not good enough. So I couldn't get an academic job, and not a single offer. And so I lucked out because I had I'd done a summer internship in Washington, and the economist who supervised me liked me a lot, and he had a friend who was at Mathematica, and said, "You got to hire Moffitt, okay? He doesn't have a job. Please hire him, and he's very much interested in this negative income tax experiment." Negative income tax experiment, if you're not aware, that's the economics word for a guaranteed annual income welfare program. The poor get a minimum. Today we would call that something related to a UBI, or universal basic income, or any kind of universal program. And it was a very popular idea even back then, and it's still around even today. So there were a bunch of true experiments that had been run in the 70s in several cities, where they randomized a low-income population, and then the treatment group got the guaranteed annual income program, and the control group did not. And they just did a experiment, one of the earliest big social experiments that were done. And we were all analyzing the data, and I went, and they hired me to work on that. And that's really, I really got started on the welfare programs. And I spent 3 or 4 years there analyzing the data. I was able to publish articles out of it. Lots of interesting results. I'm a very big proponent of the guaranteed annual income myself, and there are lots of issues about how to design it, which I'm now I feel I've studied for many years. I was just beginning then, and it was just a perfect thing for me because policy relevance, to use my economics, and then I acquired these skills because at this firm, Mathematica, which is, if you haven't heard of it, it's a top-notch research firm that does just outstandingly high-quality evaluations, generally for the federal government funding. And so I learned so much about both policy, evaluation methods, econometrics, all kinds of things. And it's also where I had my first exposure to demography, which I can talk about anytime you'd like me to start on that. But it was a non-academic job, and I did eventually move to academics afterwards. But I learned a lot there. It was really a good fit for me, and it was luck that I got a good job there.
I wanted to ask you about how you wrote your first paper. Because it looks as if this was the period in which you started to write papers.
That's right, yeah.
How did you know how to write one? Because you said back at Brown,
yeah,
you may not have gotten that kind of guidance, and you probably weren't particularly productive in that sense then. Is this when that began to happen? And if so, how did you proceed?
Well, it was a learning curve. I was always interested in academic publishing, even though I was not a non-academic organization. A lot of the other researchers there did not regularly publish in economic journals. They produced government reports, and that's where it ended. But I wasn't interested. I really wanted to publish, and so these guaranteed annual income experiments were of great interest to the academic community, as well as just the government policy community. And there were great publication opportunities there and here I was doing something really interesting, these experiments, new results. There was a session at the American Economic Association on these experiments in the early 70s, and like 1,000 people came to the room. It was overflowing, people couldn't get in. Just a really, really topic everybody in the economics profession was talking about, and some very distinguished economists were working on it. So I started writing, but there were a few other people at Mathematica who had published, and so I got some help from them. But to be honest, it was trial and error, and I did the same thing everybody does. You read what's out there already and try to write a paper modeling yourself on the articles that have already been published. A lot of the papers I look back on now, those were terribly, terribly written. Dense, who can understand this? You explain what you're doing, Professor Dr. Moffitt, but and some of them never got published, thankfully, probably. But I learned, and you get referee reports and editor comments, and I got better at it. And the one thing was really good at Mathematica that helped me there, actually, I've forgotten all about this, is they had an editor, a professional editor, okay? And she would go over my papers and just mark them. I mean, they were like, every page was filled with red marks, And at first you always react, come on, let me write my own paper here. But as I got more, I started to appreciate that. And to the extent I have any writing ability at all today, scholarly, it's due to her. And she taught me how to explain yourself, speak in simple terms, explain what you're doing, use the right words. It was, and most people don't get that. And that was another a piece of luck, really. So anyway, that's a little bit on how I got started.
I want to stay on that paper just a little bit longer. Those sure. First few papers that I guess you don't want to read them anymore. But when you were first writing those papers, you mentioned you had your hands on a lot of data, really interesting new data, and I can imagine the kinds of data you were seeing. At that point, did you realize that you were sort of veering into population science? Did you see yourself as a demographer? Were you doing the things that your demography peers, if you had them at that time, were doing? Or did that come a little bit later on?
Well, let me then tell you the story of demography at Mathematica, which was that I didn't know anything about demography as a graduate student or when I started there. But Mathematica was a for-profit research company, which means you wrote proposals all the time. Actually, that was another great thing. I learned how to write a proposal, and there were all these senior people around me who knew how to write a proposal and how to get funding. And they just write proposals all the time, okay? And you work collaboratively. I mean, that's your bread and butter. You almost didn't have time to actually do the research because you're always trying to fund your whole salary, basically. And most of it was federal government research. So I really learned that skill. But anyway, there was another economist there who was my same vintage who'd come to Mathematica. Barbara Devaney is her name. Barb is still a very active researcher. She stayed at Mathematica, but she came from the University of Michigan. Okay, now University of Michigan, is a great social science university, as everyone knows, and has a very strong population program. And she was all involved in the population program of there. So she walked into my office one day and she plopped down a piece of paper, and of course we didn't have computers. Everything, was on paper, but it was an RFP, a request for proposals. Which means, write an invitation to write proposals. She said, hey, there's this RFP from NIH on the Easterlin hypothesis. And said, Barb, I just have two questions for you. What is NIH? And number two, what is the Easterlin hypothesis? And so she explained it to me. I said, well, that sounds interesting. And I started learning more about the Eastern hypothesis, and she started cluing me in on the world of demography and what was coming out. Easterlin was an economist, but he was speaking to demographers, and his hypothesis, which was the so-called relative income hypothesis, had a great deal of attention paid in demography because he was trying to explain the baby boom. And his whole hypothesis was, in fact, we should talk more about Easterlin today, really, in my view. But his whole hypothesis was this relative income hypothesis that young men and women, their decisions are very much influenced on how their income is relative to their parents. And if you're doing very well relative to your parents, you have a very optimistic view of life, and he thought that meant having more children and moving forward because your incomes were so much higher than you expected them to be. It should be talked about more today because we're in the opposite situation where younger generations are not doing as well as their parents, and you could probably explain a lot today with that hypothesis. But it was a great hypothesis because he was modifying an economist's view. The economist's view says this is income. You're not comparing it to anything that matters. He said, no, it's relative to income. And it was a great attention to sociologists because the whole idea of social norms is what that's all about. What norms, how they would get established, and how are you making your decisions, your subjective perceptions of how well off you are. It's very subjective. It's not just how much cash you have. So it was really interesting, and we applied for a grant and wrote one together, and we got one. I don't know how we got one, but because we were both novices. And we did some work on and then I started reading more about demography, and Barb kind of filled me in on it. And I said, this is really cool stuff. And I was interested in some of the methods because I'm an economist. Economists get trained in methods pretty heavily, and I had a lot of methods. So I got this old Shyrock and Siegel book on methods, material demography. I read it from cover to cover. I said, man, this is great. And live tables and everything. And so, but it's all self-educated. I've never taken a course in population or demography in my life. And later on, I was lucky to have been exposed at universities to great demographers and learned a lot more later. But really, it was self-educated at the beginning, and just my own reading, and I was just fascinated by it, and that's what got me started.
One more question from me, and then I'm sensing that colleagues will jump in. And
sure.
I think we all want to get your bird's eye view of the field now and what the major changes are. We have time, but
sure.
I'm still kind of in your CV, and
Okay.
I see that you do make the move to the academic side, and it looks like it happened at Penn. at the public policy school, very briefly. And then you went, I think there was a Rutgers stint shortly after there. So you turned that corner, you made that move, you got hired as a lecturer first. Tell us about that. That was the earliest pathway.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, that early career is all about personal connections, and so here we are, network world, you know. But I got that job at Penn because there was a economist at Mathematica he was working on the guaranteed income experiments, but he was a professor at Swarthmore, which is not too far away, and had a joint appointment at Penn. And he knew I was interested in moving to academics, and I was trying to publish and so on. And Penn had, again, it wasn't, public policy was not demography, you know, I still wasn't kind of clued in on the great pop center there. So, but he said, if you're interested, why don't you come and be a lecturer, kind of get some academic experience under your belt, some teaching experience, exposure, something you could put on your CV. And it was, again, you know, just the right person. And Robinson Hollister is his name. He's an economist, but he was worked on poverty programs, and very distinguished guy who's now long since emeritus. But the you know, you meet these people at certain times in career, and people help you along, you know, and they do things for you. That's how I got my job at Mathematica. And then I got the job at Penn the same way. And then I got the job at Rutgers after that, which was my first real full-time permanent tenure track job, only because there was an economist there who worked on poverty, and he knew some people at Mathematica, and they said, you know, hire Moffitt. And that's how I got started. And then I got, you know, an assistant professor of economics. And like most assistant professors, I started working 24/7. I was there all the time. I worked on the computer. I started doing research, and I was interested in, and I was still working a little with Barbara Devaney, so I was doing demography and more. I got very interested in fertility, economic models for fertility. If you look at my CV, some of my early work is on fertility and marriage, and just combined it with my interest in poverty. And eventually, I've evolved now to where I've done a lot of different kinds of economic demography, but now it's mostly about the relationship between welfare programs and marriage and single motherhood and things like that. That's kind of the niche that I'm really working in now. But yeah, you know, I stumbled into these things, and then after Rutgers, I was lucky enough to eventually turn to my alma mater, to Brown, which is another story if you have time. But
why don't we hear that story, and then we'll open up, because these stories are
well,
really fascinating.
The funny story about my return to Brown is because I did start publishing then, and I was fortunate in getting a lot of public articles published that got quite a few citations, and my reputation rapidly grew in those first early years. And Brown, the economics department, was still the old mathematical, you know, no policy, no data please, you know, kind of department. But the profession was rapidly changing, and economic departments around the country were rapidly hiring and developing young people who did empirical work, policy-oriented work, the family, economic demography. I mean, Michigan, Wisconsin, Berkeley, all of these departments were doing it, and the Brown said, gee, I guess we better, you know, hire somebody who does this. What about our former graduate student, Moffitt? He's turned out to be okay, after all. He actually was able to get some stuff published. And why don't we talk to him about coming back? And I went back, and I was it. I was like number one. There was nobody else in the department, and it was Brown. It's a very distinguished university, so I was very interested in coming back, and that's the story of how it was kind of funny. And then I helped build up the department a little bit more in that direction, and that's when I really met demographers over in the Population Studies and Training Center at PSTC. Sid Goldstein was still around then, and I met our current president, John Casterline, there. Frank Goldscheider was there. You know, lots of people who aren't with us anymore, like Al Spear, were there. A bunch of really distinguished demographers at Brown. So I really, and I went over there all the time and became part of the Pop Center. And so that's the story of Brown, and kind of where I really even further got deeper into demography and learned a lot from all the demographers over there.
Is it fair to say that you brought data to Brown? Is that something that you could probably say that did happen?
I could say that. I could definitely say that. Data and just social policy, really, to the economics department. The faculty there were all interested in economic growth or mathematical models of the economy or macroeconomics, inflation, unemployment. And so I brought that there. I built up databases. I modernized the computing facilities, all the statistical software, and we started hiring other faculty and graduate students. And then suddenly, it's just a popular topic for any student. I mean, what's not to like about using your tools for social policy? So all the graduate students suddenly, I even got some of demography. A guy named Michael Rendall, who's now at Maryland, was my student. He came over from sociology, and I supervised him, and we wrote a couple of papers together, one of which is in demography and on single motherhood. Very excellent student then. And now an excellent demographer. So the students were part of that too, that I helped build up at Brown. So today Brown has, just like every other department, has a lot of people like that. They have a very good Pop Center. A lot of those economists at Brown today are in the associates of the Pop Center. It's really interdisciplinary. It's just not like it was there. But I guess I credit myself with getting the ball rolling.
Which is not easy back then, because unless I'm getting my timing wrong, when you started there, we were still using mainframes, weren't we? So it wasn't easy
Absolutely.
work.
No, there were no PCs, so you had mainframes, you did have at least remote, terminals. So, but there was across campus there was a computer center, and where all the mainframes were, and where all the magnetic tape, reels were, and you'd take your magnetic tape over there, and they'd store it in the cabinet, and then you'd have to get back, mount my tape, please, and wait half an hour, and okay, somebody mounted it, and then attached it, and I was a Fortran programmer. I didn't use any of there weren't good software programs back there either, and so I learned how to write my own original Fortran programs then, and you had card decks. So the whole history of that, which seems so ancient today, and we started having some algebraic computational machines, these huge adding machines. They're very large, and you type into them, and they would kind of do some simple calculations. But the PCs didn't come until later in the 1980s, really. I helped set all that up, and it was laborious, to say the least. But it just seems like another era right now. But that's what we did.
So one more question from me, and I'm hoping colleagues will jump in. I want to step back and look at the whole field now. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can start with PAA, because that's this context.
Yep.
I don't know I'm not sure if this is the best way to frame this, but maybe how has the field changed from your first PAA to today? Just thinking about what we talk about. Mm-hmm. And when was your first PAA, and how did that happen? But PAA might be a good way to sort of take stock and monitor the major changes in our field. How would you comment on that? And then I think we can probably
sure, I'd be happy to
ask some more questions that are kind of from that bird's eye view.
I think my first PAA was in the 1980s. I think it wasn't until I went to Brown and I met all the demographers. Sidney Goldstein had been president of PAA back in 1975 and was very well connected to it, and so was Fran Goldscheider and John Katcheline, and I think I went to my first one right around then. And of course, PAA is a great organization, and not only on scholarship, but the great thing about PAA is it's the personal nature of it, which I've never found any other association, and the collegiality of PAA, which I greatly admire. But the field, has definitely changed, and from my initial study of it, I mean, when I first got interested in demography back in the Mathematica years, so that was the late 1970s, even then, it was pretty much dominated by population control and family planning and related kind of issues. And there's a lot of very important issues. The social demography side was really in its infancy. And the big change I see, that particularly from my perspective, is the growth of social demography. And you come here and, you know, the number of sessions on it, something related to it, is tremendous. But the field as a whole, I think, is just, certainly this is not news to anybody really in the profession, is how the demography is broadened out and how it emerged from just those core, not that the core is not important, fertility, mortality, marriage, and so on, has so broadened out to other things. You come around here, you've got, health, population health. You've got applied demographers. You've got geographers. You've got survey issues, survey statisticians, Census Bureau. They were kind of always involved. You've got economists, of course, here. You've got anthropologists. It's just a big tent. And that's the nice thing about demography. I think it is big tent. Although I got to say, there's a little bit of tension there. Okay, and you got to expect a little bit of tension between the traditionalists. This is what demography should be, and the younger people who say, no, I want to do this. It's not quite the traditional stuff. I want to bring this in. And it's a natural kind of tension, but I think the battle is over. We're a big tent now, and a lot of different disciplines are represented here, and I think that's very healthy, and I think it's one reason for the vibrancy of an intellectual excitement of demography. 4,000 submissions this year. And the number of people who come, and all the young people who are interested in all these different aspects of demography. This is just thriving. And that's because of the broadening out, I think, and because so many people are coming in and being welcomed, and being made part of PAA. And that's why it succeeded. And I think the PAA and the PAA board and president have to play a little bit of a role in there. If we talk about PAA, I'll say more about that. But that's what I see. I think it's just gone through a tremendous evolution. And that was even when I went to Johns Hopkins. It was still Johns Hopkins. The demographers there were all population control. I mean, we still have some people like Stan Becker, distinguished demographer who works on those issues. But then Andy Cherlin was there, and I mean, okay, inequality, poverty, and it's also evolved. So it's the field. It's gone through tremendous development and very healthy in my view.
Mm-hmm. Could we talk a little bit about that, though? Because one of the things that we, the committee, have realized over the years is that because demography is an interdisciplinary field, mm-hmm. and there are very few departments of demography, the PAA does play a role in bringing demographers together and doing stuff for demographers that they can't get done anywhere else. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. And most demographers are scattered out in all kinds of organizations. If you talk about universities, typically in sociology departments, but usually a minority, 2 or 3. You don't have that many people to talk to. Usually if you're in a sociology department, Johns Hopkins or a lot, or in our School of Public Health, kind of a health-oriented sociology, demography focused there. A lot of work for the government, Census Bureau and NCHS and NIH and places like that. So they kind of all fit in. But yeah, I think I'm just going to say I completely agree. Here you can come and talk to people like you, who are interested in exactly the same things you are. And I mean, we have good training programs, but then